Do you hear that? That's the sound of my desk fan, which I have to now turn off and close the windows to not get any noise into the microphone, even though it's like super hot. I mean, it's 30 degrees. I don't know what that is in Fahrenheit, like 300. And it feels like so hot because there's no air conditioning in the UK. So it's like, and my palms are sweaty and reminds me of that Eminem song, even though I'm not Eminem. I don't know what's happening. All right, let's actually get going with our code. So in the last video, we created the user model, which is right here. And let me make this bigger. So we just created these two basic fields, and we populated the database. Going to open my SQL command line. I'm going to be using the command line from now on because for me it's easier to use. We populated our database with like some dummy users. So if I select from chat.users, we see, oh, did I delete them? Oh, I think I've deleted them off camera. Anyway, you probably have those two users still. Good thing that I deleted them because we need to actually change the user model, add more fields. Some people actually have already commented asking, oh, where's the password field? And to those people I say, here you go. Here goes the video in which you get the password field. Anyway, let's actually, enough of the cringy stuff, and let me get to the code. Okay, so let's go back to VS Code. So here in the model, I'm going to add the password field. So here I'll just say password, and this will have a type of data types dot string. And by the way, you can specify a string length. By default, it's a Sql varchar of 255 length. So let's say, for example, if you wanted to limit the username to a maximum of 20 characters, you can just do this. Let's say if we wanted to limit the email to 100, you just say like that. Because right now, if you, I'll just say use chat to use that database. And I'll say describe users. And there we go. It shows us that the username and the email right now are varchar 255 types. So I'm just going to do this just to demonstrate that this actually works. And for the password, I'm going to leave it as the default 255. I'm going to say allow null or false because, of course, the user has to have a password. And I'm going to add another field, which is the image URL for the user. We're not going to be handling image upload in this series. It's a bit beyond the scope of just the chat app. I'm going to be adding just like some URLs to an existing image right there on the internet. So here I'll say datatypes.string, and I'm not going to say allow null to false. I'm okay with that. So let's save, and we need to update the migration. Usually you would actually create a new migration to add columns. But since this is like a local project, it's not been pushed to like a server and you have to like actually add another migration. I'm just going to edit this one, cancel it, and then run it again. Like here you can, by the way, you can go to your database and there's another table. So if we say show tables, and it shows us there's another table called Sqlize meta, which holds the, so if say select star from Sqlize meta, you'll see, semicolon, you see that it holds all the migrations that we've run, and that's how Sqlize knows which to run and which to cancel. So here if we go back to our migration, and we can just copy this one down, so and change this to password. I'm gonna add those lengths again, so the username is 20 and the email is 100 characters. And for the password, I'm just gonna leave it like that. Of course, it's not unique. And the image URL as well. So we'll say image URL, not data types, Sqlize. That's a bit confusing when you're between models, and here it's Sqlize and there it's data types, even though it's kind of the same. But that's fine. Actually, we could, if you want, you could change this, like all of these to like data types if you want to, because this is just like an argument of a function. It doesn't make a difference. But I'm just gonna keep it as the convention they made it out to be. I'm sure it serves like a purpose. So here I'll open the command line. Let me make this a bit bigger. So here I want to cancel that migration. So I'll say Sqlize db migrate undo. If you do undo, it's just going to cancel the last migration, and if you undo :all, it's going to cancel all migrations. Now you have to be careful with this command, because if you have some data, it's going to remove that. You remove that data, you remove those columns or remove that table. So you have to be careful with this command. But we don't have any data, so I'm just going to run it and let it run. All right, so now if we go back to our database and say show tables, we should see that, yeah, the users table is gone. Now I'm just gonna say db migrate to migrate this, and now we should get our users table back. So if we say describe users, ooh, did I misspell something? Describe users. There we go. So we get our added fields, the password and the image URL. And we also have the 20 length and the 100 length on the username and password. So that actually took place. Now, what we need to do now, we need to be able to create these users from, just interacting with the API without having to manually create them through SQL. So let's go to GraphQL, and here in the type definitions, I'm gonna add a mutation for a user to use to register on the application. So here I'll say type mutation, and inside of it, so here we have all of our mutations inside of this, and here we have all of our queries. And inside of here, I'm just gonna say, call it register, and it will take a couple of things. So it will take a username, which is a string, and we do exclamation mark because it's required. It's going to take an email, which is a string. And by the way, you can put commas or not, it's the same. So email, and it's going to take a password, which is as well a string, and it's required. And it's going to as well take a confirm password to make sure that the user typed it twice and it's the same password and they didn't make a mistake. And we're going to say colon, so it's going to return the user back, and that's required. So let's hit save, so it formats it. And let's go ahead and create this mutation. So here in the resolvers, under query here, I'm going to add a key called mutation with a capital M. And inside this object, I'm going to have the register mutation. So here it will be an async function. And what it's going to do, it's going to take input from the user and create this user basically. And here we're gonna need to take what the user input. So what a function, a basic query, or like a basic resolver rather, usually takes four things. So we have a thing called parent, an args, I believe context first, yeah, context, and info. Not to confuse you too much, parent is something that we don't worry about in this series. It's basically like the object that's passed over from the other resolver, but here this is a top resolver, so parent usually has nothing. So I'm gonna omit it, but because we need the second one, it has to be there because we need the second argument, which is args, which is arguments, which are basically these arguments that are passed to the resolver. So these four things will be stored in the args, and if it was another resolver, any arguments that are passed to the method, to the query or mutation, are going to be stored in this one. And the context and the info are something we don't worry about for now. We're going to get to later, so I'm just going to remove them. So here we need to actually extract our variables from the args. So here I'll say const, and I'm going to destructure them. So I'll say username, comma, email, comma, password, comma, confirm password. And here I'll say equals args to get them from the args, and I'm going to say try and catch because we're going to do some async stuff. I'm going to interact with our database, and I'm gonna write them in a set of to-dos to show you what we need to do. First thing, we need to validate input data, and which involves like checking that none of these fields are empty, and then also checking if the username exists in our database, and also for the email. Actually, that needs its own to do, so I'll say to do check if username / email exists. So if they exist in our database, we need to tell the user that you cannot take, like, this username or this email is taken. So you need to use a different one. Third step is, so if the data is valid, then we're going to create the user. So we'll say to do create user. And here we need to return the user to our client. So return user. All right, so let's start with, actually I'm gonna start with just creating the user for now, and we'll get to the rest. So if we get an error, let's just console log the error, and let's throw it as well to get it on the as a GraphQL error response. So here, so we have our fields, right? So we need to import our user model first. Actually, we've already imported it in the last video. So here I can just say await user, and we're gonna use the create method. And this is really simple. So we're gonna pass the fields of this of what we need to persist in our database. So we need to persist the username, and since we already have a variable called username, we don't need to do colon username like this. We can just say username like that, and it will know that we're talking about this username right here. So here we'll say email as well, and the password, and yeah, that's it. Of course, we're going to later check that these passwords are the same, they match together, and I'm just going to test this creation for now. So here I'll say, well, actually we need to store this in a variable, so I'll say const user equals all of that, and I'm just going to say return user, and we're just going to return the object. One thing that you need to know about Sqlize, this user object right here actually holds a couple of other methods that we can use, like getters and virtuals and some other stuff. But when you return it, when you just say return and you return the user, it actually returns a JSON version of this user holding all the keys. So you don't have to worry about, there is another method called toJSON, but by default, when you have return in front of the user an instance of a Sqlize model, it automatically calls this for you, so you don't need to do it, which is pretty cool actually. All right, let's save this and let's test it out. So in the command line, I'm going to run npm run dev, and I'm going to close this command line and close this sidebar to get as much code as we can. All right, so that's run, and let me hit this, control click that. Let's remove this query and let's test out that mutation. So if you click control space, it should actually, because we have only one, it actually auto fills it because we have only one mutation. So here we have our register mutation, and we need to pass it all those fields. So let's say we have a username of John and an email of john@email.com. Gonna go back to a new line and give it a password of 12346 and a confirm password of 1 through 6 as well. And of course, because it returns a type user, we need to take at least one field of from the user. So we'll just say username and email, and let's run that. And there we go. It says data, and of course, because when GraphQL responses, whenever you have a successful response, you get an object with a data key, and inside of that key, that object, the main object is called the same name of the mutation. So in this case, our mutation is called register. Our data will be inside of this register object. And there we go. So this means it was successful. So let's actually double check. I'm going to open the MySQL terminal and say select star from users. And there we go. So we get our user inside of our database. Of course, it doesn't have an image URL because, you know, we don't do that through the code. And of course, this needs to change. The password shouldn't be stored as just a string like that. That's actually one thing I forgot about. We need to, I'm gonna add another to do here. To do hash password. So we're gonna hash the password because, you know, and if you have like some security problem and your database got leaked, the password is stored in a completely gibberish way. All right, so I'm gonna open a new terminal, and I'm gonna install something called bcrypt. So say npm install how do I spell bcrypt? Yeah, like this, bcrypt. Oops, I can't spell, guys. The heat has melted my brain. Bcrypt.js. All right, so let's go up here. Oh, is it what? BCR. Oh man, I misspelled that. Bcrypt. Why is this word so hard to spell? Oh, there we go. All right, bcrypt.js. We can do it, guys, or I can do it. Okay, so const bcrypt. I'm just gonna call it bcrypt equals require bcrypt. Oh, thank you, autocomplete. Thank you, VS Code, so I don't have to spell that again. So, wow, that's actually massive, 300 kilobytes. I didn't know that. Thank God this is in our server, not in the client. All right, so here we'll say we're just gonna actually change the value of the password itself and say equals. We're gonna use the, actually it's asynchronous, so say bcrypt dot what is it, gensalt? No, it's actually hash. And this takes the password itself, so which will be password, and like a salt rounds. Let's just give 6. Usually they use 6 in the documentation example. All right, so I'm just gonna save that, and our server is already running, so we should be fine. Let's go back to Chrome. Okay, I'm gonna change here the username to Jane and the email to jane@email.com, and let's run that. Assignment to constant variable. Oh, sorry. Here the password is a constant, so let's just change this to let, so that we can actually change the value of this. Let's save that. Go back to Chrome. So here, if I run this, it should be successful. And there we go. That was successful. And if we look at our database, select from users again, and there you go. So the password is now hashed. All right, so one other thing, of course, we need to validate the data, because right now if we just send empty strings, it's actually going to register a user with like with empty strings as username and email, and we don't want that to happen. So let's go here under validate. I'm going to remove this to do because we've done that, and this one as well, and this one. And under validate, we're going to do some like really crude validation just to check that these strings are not empty. So I'll say if email, actually I'll say email.trim, because it can have, like, we need to trim the white spaces and around the edges. I'll say if email.trim equals empty string. Actually what I'm going to do is I'm going to create an errors variable, or an errors object. And if there's any errors, I'm going to add them to this object and then throw them and then return them to our client. So here I'll say if email.trim equals empty string, I'll say errors.email equals, and we'll say email must not be empty. I'm going to repeat this a couple of times. So Alt Shift down arrow. Here I'll say Control D, select these 3 and say password. And or this should be actually the username because of the order, and this will be password, and the 4th one will be confirm password, except here it should be like capital P, or actually let's just leave it as it is, it's fine. So here we'll have confirm. Maybe this on the client will be repeat password. Must not be empty. That's cool. So that will make sure that they're not empty. And of course, we need to check in our database whether this whether there is a user with this username or password. Because if there is, we need to throw an error and say like you need to use a different username or email. So did I say password? I meant email. All right, so here we'll say we're gonna fetch a user from our database. So just to check, so we'll say const user, or let's say const user by username. Actually, I'm gonna show you 2 ways of doing this, just as a reference. So the first way will be this simple way. So we'll say await user dot, and we'll use a function called a method called find one. Which does exactly that, takes a condition, and our condition would be, here we'll say an object and has a key called where, and here we can say what we need to check, and we need to check for the username field, and of course the value would be username, but since that's the same name, we can just leave it as it is, like this. And if it finds a user, it's gonna return the user there. If it doesn't, this will be null. So we can just check if this is not null, that means we don't have a user with this username, so that means we can proceed and actually create it. I'm gonna repeat this one more time and replace this with email. So email make this capital E right there. And okay, so underneath here, I'll say if user by username. So if that's not null, so we'll say errors dot username equals, and we'll say username is taken, and repeat that one more time, actually one, not two. And here I'll change this to Control D twice and say email like that. Of course, this needs to be lowercase e, and that should do it. And here I'm gonna check if, so right here we have like the errors object. So if we go through here and none of these are empty, the errors object is still an empty object. And here as well, if there's no user in our database with that email or username, that means our errors object still has no keys. So for us to know that there is no errors, we're gonna check if this errors object has any keys. That means we have some errors, so we just need to like throw the errors back to our client. So here I'll say if, I'll use the JavaScript object namespace and say dot keys and pass the errors object and say dot length. This will give us the number of keys inside of this error object, and we'll say if it's bigger than 1, that means we actually have some errors, so we need to throw them. For this, actually I'm just gonna say throw errors. Usually you do actually create a new error here and then you throw it, but I'm gonna use a different methodology. I'm gonna show you why I did that in a second. I need to import actually an Apollo server error, so I'm gonna import, so I say const and destructure something called user input error, and this will come from Apollo server. And here that we threw these this object, here inside of our catch block, we need to say throw new user input error and pass it. Actually, no, it takes a message and then a payload. So here I'll do like that, and the message will just be like bad input. This doesn't matter. We're not going to use this on the client. We're actually going to just access these and use them on the client. I'm going to console log it just to show you that it's actually working. I'm going to clear the console just for some clarity. So I'll say npm run dev and run the server. Go back to Chrome. Now here, if I send empty fields, it should actually return an error. So let's run that. There we go. So we get bad input, and if we go down here, we get extensions, and we get, oh, actually, I want to pass I did a mistake. So here, this is why it spread them like that. I want to pass this inside of an errors object. So here I'll say errors, and it will be this errors that we got there. So just do like that, and this should change that. So yeah, so I want to get this errors object inside of extensions so I can access it on the client side and access these keys better than just accessing extensions itself. So yeah, there we go. We get the errors, and if I put something in the email, like just some gibberish, we don't get like email is actually, oh, the username is taken because we have a user with an empty string. So actually the other validation is working as well. But I'm gonna delete those users because that's a bit confusing to test for empty string. So I'm gonna say delete from users, which should empty that table. There we go. So here it should actually, yeah, it will say username must not be empty because it's an empty string. And of course, if I put as well like an empty string like that, it's gonna do the same because we were running the trim function. So for empty username, that's a problem. Empty email, that's a problem. So if I put an email again, john@email.com, and if I put a username of John, now we need to actually add validation for password. Oh, actually, let's check for the empty strings. Yeah, there we go. So must not be empty. We need to add validation to check if the password and the confirmed passwords match. So let's go back to our code. So we can just simply right here say if password does not equal confirm password. Confirm. Where did it go? There we go. Confirm password. I'm actually going to add it to the confirm password key. So I'll say errors.confirm password equals passwords must match. and that should do it. I'm going to remove this to do, close this terminal, it's taking up too much space, so remove this to do, and save. That should do it. Let's go back, run this. There we go. Password must match. Actually, no, it should be passwords. Save that. Yeah, passwords must match because they're different. And now if they're the same, it will actually register the user and return the user. And now if we run it again, it should error because this username and this email are taken. So let's run it. There we go. Get username is taken and email is taken. Now, what we could do, actually, a different way of validating this, which I would usually use, is without actually running these queries. Because if I open the terminal to show you, actually, let me clear this and run it again. It's one thing that I actually forgot to mention, is that by default in Sqlize, when you run any queries on your database, it logs them to the console. So there you go. So once we send that, we get that we executed two SQL queries, one which is this first one to find the user by the username, and this one to find them by the email. So this is a bit less efficient technically because we're running two queries instead of just one. What we can do is we can rely on the Sql validation because we have already a unique constraint on our email. So we should technically be able to run the insert statement and have that fail through SQL, and then we will be able to know that it actually failed and then return an error. So that will be just one SQL query, because technically here it's going to execute two, and if all the data is valid, it's going to then execute a third query in our database to create that user. So what we can do is we can go back here. So where are we? In the resolvers. So we can skip check-in for whether the user, I'm just going to comment it out, leave it as a reference. I'm going to skip this, just comment it out and come down to here, actually hash the password, even though maybe the username and the email are taken. Actually close this console and just actually run the create function. And if the username or the email do exist, it's going to fail and it's going to throw an error here. And we're going to look at that error and see what that is. So let's save. I'm going to open the console, make it big, and let's go back to Chrome. I'm going to run this and this should fail. And there we go. We get an error, and the name of the error is Sqlize unique constraint error because it's the actual SQL unique constraint error. And there we go. We get a bunch of stuff. But what's important is we get an errors array inside of it, and it has one error, because that's what SQL does. If it finds that username, it just stops there. It doesn't check whether the email exists. So it's just going to give us one field, which is okay. They can again check if the email is valid. So we can extract this actually. So what we can do is, let's go back, let's copy this, the name of the error. Just copy that, go back to our code, close this console. And here what I'll do is I'll say if error.name equals Sqlize unique constraint error. That's a mouthful. We can extract the error from that object and add them to our errors object and return that. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to make sure, yeah, okay, this is declared way up here, so we have access to it. So inside of here, I'll say, what am I going to do? Yeah, so we have the error, and that has the errors object array. I know it's a bit confusing. There's too many errors, but bear with me for a second. So here I'll say .errors .for each, and for each error I'm just gonna add one to our object. So I'll say error, and that we need to return an object, or sorry, a key and a value, and this will be actually no, we're gonna set a key in our error here. So we need to name that key with the name of whatever field this was, whether username or email. The way we can do that is, so inside of that error, if you observe, where is it? All right. Okay, it's here. So the path, or which represents the column inside of that table, is stored inside of this path variable, and the message of the error is right here. So what we can do, we can just say add a key, and that key's name. So we'll say errors, our errors object, and we add a key, and we can add it like this. We can just say e.path to get the name of the key, which in this case is username, and the value will be e.message. and now we can just actually we could just return the errors like this, and it will automatically take this errors object right there. And let's save. So that will actually persist this error to that errors object, and now we can get it. So let's go back to Chrome and run this. There we go. So we get our errors object, and it says username must be unique. Now, of course, we need to change this message because our client will be like, what is this? This is like an SQL error. So that's, how do we change? Actually, I can just, because there's no messages from the model, because this is an SQL error, we need to actually manually write the message. But that's easy. I can just say here, so it equals, because we know this is a unique constraint error, we can actually just say like this, do template string, like backticks, and like do $ curly braces e.path, and that's the name of the field, and say is already taken, like that. Let's go back to Chrome, run that, and there we go. Username is already taken. Cool. So, and it does the same for email. So if we do John's, which doesn't exist, but the email exists, it will tell us that email is already taken. Sweet. And of course, if we do something that exists, it's gonna register it successfully. So that doesn't exist rather. So Jane, and Jane is registered. Cool. One thing that we need, excuse me, one thing that we need to actually do, because let's do Jane's like this. This will run, which is like wrong because this is not a valid email. One thing that we can actually make use of that comes with Sqlize is these validators that we can run on our fields. So we can, so here, where is it? Yeah, it's the email here. We can add a key called validate, and you can go to the documentation, and here in validations and constraints, and if you scroll down, you can see there's a bunch of different like ways that we can validate. These are just by the way, JavaScript validations that apply before the SQL query is executed. So we can do a bunch of different things like to validate our fields before trying to persist them on the database. So I'm interested in the is email, this one right here. So I'm just gonna grab it and go back here. And inside of this validate object, I'm gonna add that, but there's a twist here. I'm not gonna say it's just true. I'm gonna pass it as an object, and here I'll say args, and this means like what is the value? Here is true. That means this field has to be an email. And there's another key here, which is MSG, which is a message, which is the error message you need to return in case this validation rule is not met. And this will be must be a valid email address, and save that. So now if this validation rule is not met, the error that would be returned for it would have this message that we wrote ourselves. So let's actually check if that's working. So here we have the email field. Now it's not a valid email, so if we run it, we get bad input, but we don't get the message. Interesting. Why is that? Let me check here. Oh, okay, because this is why, because we're not checking for this error type. We're just actually throwing errors, which is empty. So we need to check for Sqlize validation error as well. So let's close this console, because we do get that error actually, but we're just not checking for it. So here we can say else if error.name equals, and paste that Sqlize validation error. And here what we're gonna do is do the kind of the same. So error.errors dot for each, and here I'll say error and return, not return, it doesn't return actually, it's just modifying our errors object. So I'll say errors e.path like we did earlier, and it equals actually we're just gonna do the message because we've already written that in our model. So we'll just say error.message, and that should do it. So let's save. Let's go back to Chrome, run this, and there we go. We get an our errors object, and it has email. Email must be a valid email address. Cool. So if we do Janes at email, that's still not valid. We still get an error. If we do janes.email at email.com and we run that, username is already taken. Yeah, that's taken. Let's just do some gibberish. Run it. There we go. So that's a valid email, and now it runs successfully. Cool. So that was a bit. It was a bit. Was it too much? I don't know. You tell me. For me, this is like breakfast. All right. So that was it for registering a user. That was a bit like overwhelming. That's the word I was looking for. Then again, everything is overwhelming. It's super hot. I'm literally sweating. I need to turn on my fan. Anyway, speaking of fans, you fans, subscribe, like the video. Let's explode the channel. I need like 2,000 million subscribers. Otherwise, I will be depressed. All right. Thank you for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one. Cheers.